From the UFC and PFL joining hands to cross-promote the huge event, to all the drama that came along with the Predator signing a deal with PFL, here's the real reason why Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou could still happen. I gotta be honest with you. I wasn't the only one who lost all hope for this when Ngannou switched over to PFL, but even though the chances are slim at best, Randy Couture thinks the UFC and PFL can find a way to make a massive cross-promotion event happen. And you better believe him on this, because as a former two-division UFC champion who's now a PFL commentator, he knows both sides of the event here. Now here's the tricky part. They need to look out for restrictive contracts in the sport, which could make this a lot more complicated than it needs to be. But if you really want a cross-promotional fight, it's all about getting everyone on the same page. And one of the best ways to make that happen is through media and exposure, because both UFC and PFL are on ESPN. And that's where negotiations get a bit easier, since both UFC and PFL have events that air channels and stream on ESPN+. So it doesn't seem like either of them are going to have any major problems, especially for a mega heavyweight fight like this. But there's one important detail I haven't discussed, considering the fact that UFC is dominating the MMA community. Dana White needs to agree to terms with the PFL to make it all happen. And going from past negotiations, it's safe to say that'll be easier said than done. I mean, the UFC knows its place in the market, and sharing that level to promote fights might not be something White's okay with. Plus, we've seen it all happen before. When the heavyweight champion, Fedor Emelianenko, was in the prime of his career, negotiations between the two parties never worked out, simply because the UFC wasn't ready to work with Fedor's promotion in the first place. They even agreed on money, and everything would have worked out if the UFC had agreed on co-promotion. And that shows that the UFC would rather throw out a huge opportunity of promoting a major heavyweight fight if it means they've got to share some of the promotional spotlight. Now coming back to Ngannou. Let's not forget White's recent criticism over the fighter's move to PFL. To top it off, Jones is taking up every opportunity he can to fire shots at Ngannou. But that only makes me think about how a fight between the two would be an insane opportunity. Think about it. Ngannou wants the fight. And even Couture believes that the PFL is in a prime position to work with the UFC to make it happen. Plus, PFL isn't the one with an ego problem. Instead, they're interested in entertaining a co-promotion for a big fight like this, especially if it's UFC on the other side. Meanwhile, the Ngannou versus Jones fight was a huge talking point, even before the Cameroonian fighter switched to PFL. On top of that, fans had built up excitement for the clash between the two. And even after his UFC exit, where he vacated his heavyweight title and turned down the $8 million fight, he still didn't rule out the possibility of a fight. Instead, he claims he did everything he could to set up the fight, but clearly nothing worked out. I gotta say, his UFC exit definitely made this a lot more complicated, because now Jones and White are critical of Ngannou's decision to leave the UFC, right after his recent title win. In fact, they blame the Cameroonian for a fight never materializing. I mean, sure, he'd probably be fighting Jones in the ring right now if he was still linked to the UFC, but let's not forget why he left. The former champion set out a couple of reasonable demands during the negotiation, like healthcare insurance for all the fighters, but White simply wasn't ready to accept them. Yep, the UFC president was ready to throw in the smackers, but there was no amount of money that was going to make Ngannou stay. So, I don't think Ngannou was trying to avoid a fight with Jones, but was instead taking a stand for underprivileged fighters who were robbed of their rights. Not to mention, Ngannou's been trying to fight Jones for 3 years now, but something always comes up. As he said, "Yes, I wanted that fight, but not at any cost." So when he vacated his heavyweight title, White set up a fight between Jon Jones and Cyril Gane for the belt. And sure enough, Jones swooped in with a 2-minute submission win over his opponent. And ever since then, he left no opportunity to take shots at Ngannou in his post-fight conference and on social media. And I'm not surprised either, because their rivalry has come a long way. Remember when Jones debuted at number 2 in MMA Fighting's global heavyweight rankings? Well, he was right beneath Ngannou, who's still ranked at number 1 in the world, and I'm talking about the Cameroonian fighter, who's got wins over some of the best in the weight class. Could he knock out Jon Jones as well? Well, I can't say that for sure. Think about it. In all of Jones's tough fights so far, he's won by outlasting his opponents in later rounds. To top it off, he's tough to hit clean, has great footwork, and a massive reach. And that's not easy to bear. I could definitely see him staying at range and using leg and body kicks to slow Ngannou down. But the question is whether that'll be enough, and if Ngannou has a few tricks up his sleeves to overpower Jones. Because the former heavyweight champion was last in action back in 2022, and that's when he defended his UFC title, spending the rest of the year locked in a heated contract dispute with the promotion, only to finally leave the UFC and switch to its rival promotion. Although as a free agent, Ngannou was gearing up for professional boxing, and even though a bunch of reputable MMA promotions reached out to him, including Bellator and One Championship, most weren't ready to accept his demands. And like UFC, decided to pour millions of dollars into the deal instead. In the end, it was PFL that won the race. And now, Ngannou is set to debut in the league's Superfight division in 2024 and share in the pay-per-view revenue for his fights. But that's not all. He's also going to oversee the league's push into Africa as the chairman and minority equity owner of the new PFL Africa division, while also securing a seat on the PFL Athlete Advisory Board. And all of this is just what was included in the promotion's official press release. You never know what else is in store for the former heavyweight champion behind the scenes. In fact, according to MMA business reporter John Nash, Ngannou is going to receive 8 figures for each of the fights on his deal, with full control over his sponsors. And if that wasn't enough, he's also going to receive a salary from working as a PFL brand ambassador, while having total freedom to compete in boxing and call out some of the greatest heavyweight champs, like Tyson Fury. Although, I gotta admit, a bunch of fans out there still think Ngannou somehow blew it, that he's worse off than he was when he was locked into the restrictive UFC contract. But all of this just proves that UFC isn't his only option, and he made sure to respond to all the drama that came along with him signing the PFL deal, like the fact that the UFC star, Conor McGregor, couldn't stop pointing it out as a terrible decision. And in response, Ngannou mentioned he completed his contract and chose to walk away, while the UFC tried to make him stay. And the reason he fought thrice in 3 years wasn't because he was bailing out on risks, but because the UFC wanted to control his deal and lock him in a new one, now that he's got a deal where he gets the respect, pay, and freedom he demanded all along. Why is the UFC star still up against him? And if Conor wants to see a Jones versus Ngannou fight so badly, the Cameroonian fighter said he could reach out to Pete Murray, who's the CEO of PFL, and he'll set something up. Does that mean we're finally going to see the cross-promotional fight? Well, I wouldn't get my hopes up this early in the game, but let me tell you, it definitely looks like a real possibility. All you gotta wait for is White's take on this, even though I'm sure it's going to be controversial to say the least. So there you have it. From all the drama that came along with Ngannou signing a deal with PFL, to the UFC and PFL joining hands to cross-promote the huge event, that was the real reason why Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou could still happen.